The morning of the auction, there were 90 sheep nobody wanted. They stood in the back pen at the Bishop County Livestock Yard, pressed against the rails the way animals press together when they have been moved too many times in too few days. And they looked like exactly what the catalog said they were, which was a discount lot of unimproved Tunis Cross ewes from a foreclosed farm in the next county over. Their wool was patchy in places. Their ribs showed. 2 of them had a slight limp that the auctioneer had already noted aloud in a tone meant to discourage bidding, and one of them, a small ewe near the gate, was leaning against the rail with her eyes half closed in a way that suggested she had given up on the proceedings entirely. The men at the rail laughed when the lot came up. They laughed harder when the bidding opened at $50 a head and dropped almost immediately to $20. They laughed loudest when a young woman in a brown canvas jacket, standing alone near the coffee urn, raised her paddle and held it there until the auctioneer, after a long pause meant to give her time to reconsider, brought the gavel down at $18 apiece for the entire lot. Hollis Renner, who owned 400 acres of bottomland on the east side of the ridge and considered himself the unofficial judge of every transaction that passed through the yard, turned to the man beside him and said, loud enough to carry, that he had just watched somebody pay $1,620 for 90 future coyote dinners. The man beside him laughed. The auctioneer, who knew the young woman's last name and therefore knew whose granddaughter she was, did not laugh, but he did not meet her eye either as he wrote up the ticket. She paid in cash from a folded envelope, signed for the lot, and walked out to the loading chute without saying a word to anyone. And Hollis Renner, watching her go, said to no one in particular that the Cobb place had been dying for 20 years, and now it had found a way to finish the job. If this story already has you leaning in, do me one small favor before we go further. Tap the like button, and in the comments tell me the name of the town or city you are watching from, because I read every single one of them and I want to know where in the world this story is landing tonight. Now let's begin. Her name was Wren Cobb, and she was 23 years old, and she had come back to the ridge in March of that year, not because she had a plan, but because there was no longer anywhere else for her to be. Her grandmother, Ardith Cobb, was 81 and had broken her hip the previous fall, and the cousins who had been taking turns driving up the gravel road to check on her had run out of turns. Wren had been finishing a 2-year associate degree in a town 3 hours south, working nights at a diner, sharing an apartment with 2 girls she did not particularly like. And when the call came, she packed her car in an afternoon and drove home without telling the diner she was not coming back. The farm, when she pulled up the drive, looked smaller than she remembered and also somehow larger, the way places do when you return to them as an adult. The house was a 2-story frame with a tin roof that her grandfather Emmett had put on himself in 1974. The barn leaned slightly to the south, which it had been doing for as long as anyone could remember. There were 68 acres altogether, most of it sloped pasture that had been let go to broom sedge and cedar saplings, a creek that ran along the western fence line, and a stand of hardwood at the back that her grandfather had refused to let anyone log even when the money was offered and badly needed. Ardith was sitting on the porch when Wren pulled up, and she did not stand, and she did not wave. And when Wren came up the steps, her grandmother looked at her for a long moment and said, "Well, you came." Wren said she had. Ardith said, "Sit down then." And the 2 of them sat on the porch in the cold March air and watched a hawk work the field below the house, and that was the entirety of their reunion. The first 3 weeks Wren did almost nothing but learn the rhythm of the house. She cooked the breakfasts and the suppers. She drove her grandmother to the physical therapy appointments in town. She walked the fence line in the afternoons because her grandmother told her to. And she came back with reports that Ardith received without comment, nodding once and going back to whatever she was doing with her hands, which was usually mending something that did not strictly need to be mended. The land was, by any conventional measure, not worth farming. The soil test from the extension office, which Wren found in a drawer in the kitchen along with 30 years of similar papers, said the topsoil was thin, The slope was wrong for row crops, and the pH was off in ways that would cost more to correct than the resulting hay would ever sell for. Hollis Renner had offered to lease it for grazing twice in the last 5 years and had been refused both times, and the second refusal had ended a long acquaintance between him and Ardith that neither of them had bothered to mourn. The Cobb place, in other words, was understood by everyone in the valley to be a piece of ground that had outlived its usefulness, kept alive by an old woman's stubbornness, and waiting only for her to die so that someone with sense could finally do something else with it. But Wren, walking the fence line in those first weeks, kept noticing things her grandmother had not asked her to notice. The creek ran clean and steady even in the dry weeks of late March, which was unusual for a creek that size on a ridge that high. The hardwood stand at the back of the property held a kind of cool damp under it that the surrounding ridges did not, and the leaf litter there was deep and black in a way that suggested water moving through the ground beneath it. In the lower pasture there was a patch maybe a quarter-acre across, where the grass came in earlier and greener every spring than the grass around it, and the cattle that the neighbor had been allowed to run on the place years ago had always grazed that patch down first. Wren made notes about these things in a small spiral notebook she had bought at the gas station on her second day home. Not because she had any plan for the notes, but because making them felt like something a person ought to do. In the evening she would sit at the kitchen table and write down what she had seen, and her grandmother, sitting across from her with her mending, would sometimes glance at the notebook and sometimes ask a one-word question, and Wren would answer, and that was most of what passed between them in those first weeks, which was, Wren came to understand later, a great deal more communication than it appeared to be. It was on a Tuesday in the second week of April that her grandmother, looking up from a sock she was darning, said, "Your grandfather kept a book." Wren said, "What kind of book?" Ardith said, "The kind a man keeps when he is paying attention." She said it was in the chest at the foot of the bed in the back room, and that Wren could read it if she wanted, and that it would either mean something to her or it would not, and either way it was hers now. Then she went back to the sock. Wren did not go look for the book that night. She waited until the next afternoon, when her grandmother was napping, and she went into the back room and opened the cedar chest, and there, under a folded quilt and a stack of yellowed Farm Bureau magazines, was a leather-bound ledger about the size of a family Bible, with the name Emmett Cobb stamped in faded gold on the cover, and a date below it that read 1958. The ledger was not what she had expected. She had imagined vaguely a farm journal, the kind of thing a man might keep to track planting dates and rainfall. What she found instead was something stranger and more particular. The first 30 pages were a hand-drawn map of the 68 acres, done in pencil and ink over what must have been years, with elevations marked in her grandfather's careful handwriting and small notations beside dozens of points across the property. The notation said things like seep, March through June and clay shelf, 18 inches down and old, well, capped 1941 in spring, never failed. There were arrows showing the direction of subsurface flow as her grandfather understood it, and there were small numbered circles keyed to longer entries in the back of the book, where he had written paragraphs about each location in a prose that was plain and unhurried and entirely free of the kind of speculation Wren had braced herself for. The hardwood stand at the back of the property had 11 numbered circles in it. The quarter-acre patch in the lower pasture, the one that greened up early every year, had 3. The creek had notations along its entire length, including a stretch about 50 yards above the western fence where her grandfather had written, in slightly larger letters than the rest, "Water comes up here from below. Do not disturb until needed." Wren read for 2 hours that afternoon and another 3 that evening, and when she came to the kitchen for supper, her grandmother looked at her face and said, "So you found it?" Wren said she had. Ardith said, "He believed there was water under this place, more than anyone knew." He used to say the ridge was holding it like a sponge holds a spill, and that one day somebody would figure out how to use it. Wren asked why he had never tried to use it himself. Her grandmother thought about that for a long moment and said, because he was busy raising children and making the mortgage, and because the people who would have laughed at him were the same people who held the loans. Then she said, "Eat your supper." And that was the end of the conversation. But Wren went to bed that night with the ledger on her chest and lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling. And somewhere in the middle of that long awake stretch she began, without quite deciding to think about sheep. She thought about sheep because of something else her grandmother had said weeks earlier in passing, when Wren had asked why the back pasture had been let go. Ardith had said that cattle were too heavy for that ground and that her grandfather had always wanted to try sheep on it, but had never gotten around to it. Wren, who knew almost nothing about sheep, had filed the comment away the way she filed most of what her grandmother said, which was carefully and without immediate use. But now, with the ledger open beside her and her grandfather's handwriting in her head, the comment came back. Sheep were light on the ground. Sheep would graze the broom sedge and the cedar saplings down without compacting the soil. Sheep would, if her grandfather's notes were right about the seeps and the springs, find their own water in places a cattle herd could not. And sheep, more to the point, were cheap to get into if you bought the kind of sheep nobody else wanted, which was how, 3 weeks later, Wren Cobb came to be standing at the back rail of the Bishop County Livestock Yard with a folded envelope of cash and a paddle in her hand, looking at 90 thin ewes and seeing not what everyone else saw, but what her grandfather's ledger had taught her to see, which was an animal that would walk this particular ground gently and ask very little of it in return. When she got the sheep home that afternoon, in 2 borrowed stock trailers driven by a neighbor's teenage son named Caleb, who had agreed to help in exchange for $40 in supper, she opened the gate to the lower pasture and let them out, and the 90 sheep walked down the slope in a loose, ragged line and spread across the field, and the small ewe who had been leaning on the rail at the auction walked maybe 20 yards and then lay down in the grass and did not get up for an hour. Caleb, watching her, said that one's not going to make it. Wren said, "We'll see." Ardith, on the porch with a blanket over her knees, watched the sheep spread across the pasture and did not say anything for a long time, and then she said, "Your grandfather would have liked this." Wren said, "I hope so." Ardith said, "He would have." She did not say it warmly. She said it the way she said everything, which was as a fact offered for consideration, and Wren took it that way, and the two of them sat on the porch and watched the sheep until the light went down behind the ridge and the field went blue and then black, and somewhere in the dark a coyote called once from the hardwood stand and was not answered. And that was the first night the Cobb place had carried livestock in 11 years. The first month was harder than Wren had expected and easier than she had feared. 3 of the 90 sheep died in the first 10 days, which Caleb, who came by most afternoons now, whether he had been asked to or not, said was about what you would expect from a discount lot. Wren buried them at the edge of the hardwood stand and marked the spots in her notebook, not because she needed to remember, but because writing things down had become the way she thought. The remaining 87 sheep settled into the lower pasture and began to do what sheep do, which was to eat the things in front of them with a methodical disinterest that Wren found, against her expectations, deeply restful to watch. She learned their faces in the first 2 weeks. She did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. The small ewe who had leaned on the rail at the auction and who had lain down in the grass that first afternoon turned out to be the one who came to the gate every morning when Wren brought the salt block, and Wren found herself, by the end of the first month, calling her Lean without quite having decided to. Ardith, observing this from the porch, said nothing. The pasture changed faster than Wren had thought it would. The broom sedge, which had stood waist-high in patches for years, was gone in 3 weeks. The cedar saplings, which the sheep would not eat but which Caleb cut down with a handsaw on Saturdays for $2 apiece, came out of the ground in clumps and left bare circles that the grass began to fill in almost immediately. By the middle of May, the lower pasture looked like a pasture again, which it had not looked like in over a decade, and the green patch that had always greened up early was now indistinguishable from the rest of the field, which Wren noted in her book as a thing to think about. She also noted, on a Tuesday in late May, that the sheep had begun to drift, in the hottest part of the afternoon, toward the western fence line, to the stretch of creek where her grandfather had written water comes up here from below. She walked down to the spot one evening after the sheep had moved off and crouched at the edge of the creek and put her hand in the water and held it there. And the water was cold in a way that surface water in late May is not cold, and she stayed crouched there for a long time before she walked back up to the house. She did not say anything about it to her grandmother that night. She wrote it down in the notebook, and she underlined it once, and she went to bed. The first wool came off the sheep in the second week of June, when a shearer named Doyle Pruitt drove up from 2 counties south at the recommendation of the extension agent and worked his way through the flock in a day and a half for $1.50 a head. He was a thin man in his 60s with a stoop and a quiet way of working, and when he was finished he stood at the gate looking at the pile of wool in the back of his truck and said, "This is not bad wool." Wren said no. He said no. He said it was coarser than the merino he usually ran into, but that it had a length and a crimp to it that hand spinners would pay for if she could find them, and that she was not going to get rich on it, but that she should not let the buyer in town tell her it was worth nothing because it was not worth nothing. He gave her the name of a woman in Asheville who ran a fiber co-op and bought directly from small producers, and he wrote the name on the back of a feed receipt with a pencil stub he kept behind his ear, and he drove off without taking coffee. Wren called the woman in Asheville that evening from the kitchen phone. The woman, whose name was Marisol, asked questions for 20 minutes, and at the end of the 20 minutes she said she would take the entire clip at $4 a pound, sight unseen, on Doyle's word, and that she would drive up the following Saturday with cash and a trailer. Wren hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long moment, and then went out to the porch and told her grandmother, who was shelling peas, that the wool had sold for more than the sheep had cost. Ardith did not stop shelling. She said, "Well." Then she said, "That is a start." Then she went back to the peas. It was the closest thing to praise that Wren would receive from her grandmother that year, and she carried it around for days like a stone warm from a pocket. The talk at the feed store started in July. Hollis Renner, who came in on Wednesdays for the company more than the supplies, was the one who started it, although he would later claim, when pressed, that he had only been repeating what other people were already saying. What other people were already saying, according to Hollis, was that the Cobb girl had paid $18 a head for 90 doomed sheep and was now somehow not losing money on them, which Hollis attributed to beginner's luck and the unusually wet spring and the fact that she had not yet had to deal with a real winter or a real predator loss or a real veterinary bill, and which he predicted, with the confidence of a man who had been right about livestock for 40 years, would correct itself by Christmas. The named skeptic, in other words, had taken the field. The men at the feed store listened to Hollis the way they always listened to Hollis, which was with a kind of habitual half-agreement that did not require them to commit to anything, and the conversation moved on to other things. But the seed had been planted, and by August it was generally understood in the valley that the Cobb girl was running a sort of slow-motion failure on the ridge, and that the only question was how long it would take her to figure it out and sell the place to someone who could use it properly. Wren, who heard about the talk from Caleb, who heard about it from his father, who heard about it at the feed store, received the news without visible reaction. She said, "That's one approach." She said it to Caleb, who repeated it to his father, who did not repeat it to anyone because he was not sure what it meant. What Wren was actually doing in July and August, while Hollis Renner was predicting her failure, was reading. She read every page of her grandfather's ledger 3 times. She read a book on rotational grazing that Marisol had mailed her along with the check for the wool. She read the old soil tests in the kitchen drawer and compared them to the notations in the ledger, and she found that her grandfather had been keeping his own soil notes in a shorthand of his own devising on the inside back cover of the ledger, and that his notes agreed with the extension office on the topsoil and the slope but disagreed, sharply and specifically, on the question of subsurface water. The extension office had tested 2 wells on the property in 1986 and pronounced them adequate but unremarkable. Her grandfather, working from observation and from a dowsing technique he had learned from his own father, and which he described in the ledger without embarrassment and without claiming any mystical understanding of it, had mapped what he believed to be a substantial aquifer running under the eastern third of the property at a depth he estimated at between 60 and 90 feet. He had written, in the margin beside this estimate, the words, "I am probably wrong about the depth, but I am not wrong that it is there." Wren read that sentence many times. In the last week of August, she drove into town and stopped at the county clerk's office and asked to see the well records for the township, and she spent 4 hours going through them, and she found that of the 11 wells drilled within a 2-mile radius of the Cobb place in the last 30 years, 9 of them had hit water at depths between 58 and 84 feet, and that the 2 that had not hit water had been drilled on the far side of a geological fault line that ran along the county road, and that her grandfather, in the ledger, had also noted, with an arrow, and the words "water stops here." She drove home that evening with the well records photocopied and folded on the seat beside her, and she did not say anything to her grandmother about what she had found, but that night she sat at the kitchen table and opened the ledger and the photocopy side by side, and she stayed up until almost 2 in the morning. And when she finally went to bed, she lay awake for another hour, and the thing she was thinking about, the thing that would not let her sleep, was not the sheep and not the wool, and not the talk at the feed store, but the sentence her grandfather had written about the stretch of creek above the western fence, which said, "Water comes up here from below, do not disturb until needed." September came, and with it the first cool nights and the first real change in the pasture. The grass, which had been growing back faster than the sheep could eat it through the summer, began to slow, and Wren moved the flock for the first time, opening a gate she had repaired in July and letting them into the middle pasture, which had not been grazed in 9 years, and which the sheep entered the way people enter a new house, cautiously and then with sudden enthusiasm. The lower pasture behind them was left to rest, and within a week the green patch that had been indistinguishable in May was visible again, brighter than the grass around it, and Wren walked down to it one morning and stood in the middle of it and felt, through the soles of her boots, that the ground there was softer than the ground 10 feet away and slightly cooler. She made a note. The first lamb sale, although she did not yet know it would be called that, came about by accident in the second week of September, when a woman from over near Hot Springs, who had heard about the wool from Marisol, drove up the gravel road on a Saturday afternoon and asked if Wren had any lambs for sale. Wren said she did not, because the ewes had not been bred yet, and the woman said, "Oh," and stood at the gate looking at the flock for a while, and then said, "What about a ewe or 2? I am trying to start a small flock, and I cannot find Tunis crosses anywhere." Wren, who had not considered selling any of the sheep, looked at the flock for a long moment in silence, and then she said, "How many do you want?" The woman said, "4 if you have them." Wren said, "I have them." They settled on a price of $70 a head, which was almost 4 times what Wren had paid at the auction in May, and the woman wrote a check and said she would come back with a trailer the following Saturday, and she did, and she took 4 ewes, including, by her own choosing, a thin one with a slight limp that Wren had not expected anyone to want. The woman loading the limping ewe said, "This one has a good eye." Wren said, "Yes." The woman said, "The others are too pretty." The good ones are usually the ones nobody picks. Wren wrote that down later in her notebook, word for word, and underlined it. By the end of October, she had sold 11 ewes at prices ranging from $65 to $90, all to small farmers who had heard about her through Marisol or through Doyle Pruitt or through the woman from Hot Springs, none of whom Wren had ever advertised to or solicited in any way. The money from the ewe sales, combined with the money from the wool, had now exceeded the original purchase price of the entire flock by a factor of slightly more than 2, and Wren had 83 sheep still in the pasture, all of them fatter and healthier than they had been in May, and a ram that Doyle had located for her at a sale near Knoxville and brought up in the back of his truck in exchange for a side of the first lamb she ever slaughtered, which was a deal she had agreed to with a handshake and which she would honor 2 years later to the day. Hollis Renner heard about the ewe sales at the feed store in the first week of November, and he said, "Well, she got lucky on a few." He said it in the tone of a man revising a forecast he had no intention of admitting he had made. The men at the feed store, who had begun, without quite acknowledging it to themselves, to pay closer attention to the Cobb place when they drove past it on the county road, agreed that she had gotten lucky, and the conversation moved on, but it moved on a little more slowly than it would have in July. Ardith, that fall, began to come out to the pasture in the afternoons, walking slowly with the cane she had refused to use for 6 months, and she would stand at the gate and watch the sheep for 15 or 20 minutes and then walk back to the house, and she did not say anything about what she was watching. But Wren noticed that her grandmother had begun in the evenings to ask one-word questions about specific sheep and to remember the answers. The winter that Hollis had predicted would correct everything came in the first week of December, with a hard freeze and 4 inches of snow, and Wren and Caleb spent 2 days moving the flock into the lee of the hardwood stand and stringing a temporary windbreak of pallets and tarps along the north side of the makeshift fold, and the sheep sheltered there came through the freeze without a single loss. The coyotes that Hollis had also predicted came down off the ridge twice in January, and were turned back both times by a Great Pyrenees puppy named Brindle that Wren had bought in November from a farm in Madison County for $200, and which by January, at the age of 6 months, weighed almost 90 pounds and slept in the middle of the flock every night with one eye open. By the end of February, when the first lambs began to drop, Wren had not lost a single sheep to weather or predation since November, and the flock had grown, through births, to 96 animals, 6 more than she had started with the previous May, and she was, by any measure she could think of, no longer a person who had made a mistake at the auction. The lambs that spring changed everything, although the change, like all the changes on the Cobb place, came slowly and without a noun cement. There were 43 of them by the end of March, born across a 6-week stretch in the lee of the hardwood stand, and Wren had read enough by then to know which ones to pull and which ones to leave, and she had read enough to know that she did not know nearly as much as she needed to, and so she had called Doyle Pruitt twice in February and once in March, and asked questions that he had answered patiently over the kitchen phone while Ardith sat across the room pretending not to listen. 3 lambs died in the first week, which Doyle said was lower than average for a first lambing on a new place, and 1 ewe died from a prolapse that Wren could not have prevented, and which Doyle, when she described it to him afterward, said was the kind of thing that happened and that she should not carry around. She buried the ewe at the edge of the hardwood stand with the 3 from the previous spring and marked the spot in her notebook, and that evening she sat on the porch with her grandmother and did not say anything for a long time, and then she said, "I lost one today." Ardith said, "I know. You will lose more." Then Ardith said, "But you will lose fewer than most, because you watch." She said it without looking at Wren. In the same flat tone she said everything, and Wren took it the way she took everything her grandmother said, which was as a fact offered for consideration, and she carried it with her down to the pasture the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. By April, the lambs were on the ground and on their feet and following the ewes in loose, ragged clusters across the middle pasture, which had recovered from the fall grazing and come in thick and green earlier than any pasture in the valley, a fact that Caleb's father, who drove past on the county road most mornings, mentioned at the feed store in the second week of April in a tone of mild puzzlement. Hollis Renner, who was there, said that the Cobb place had always had a few odd patches and that one good spring did not make a pasture. But he said it without the edge he had used in July, and when he left the feed store that morning he drove the long way home, which took him past the Cobb place, and he slowed down on the county road and looked at the middle pasture for a long moment before he drove on. He did not stop. He did not wave. But he looked, and the looking was, although neither he nor Wren would have called it that, the beginning of a conversion that would take another 18 months to complete, and would, when it was complete, be marked by no ceremony at all. The word about the lambs began to spread in May. Through the same channels the word about the wool and the ewes had spread, which was Marisol and Doyle and the woman from Hot Springs, and now also a chef named Teodoro, who ran a small restaurant in Asheville and who had bought his first whole lamb from Wren in the middle of May at a price that made her sit down at the kitchen table for a long moment after he drove away. Teodoro was a cousin of Marisol's, and he had driven up on a Saturday morning in a white van with the name of his restaurant painted on the side, and he had walked the pasture with Wren for almost an hour, asking questions about the grass and the breed and the age of the lamb he was choosing. And when he had chosen the smallest of the lambs on offer, a ewe lamb that Wren had been planning to keep back for breeding. She told him so. He said, "That is the one I want." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because she has been eating what the ground gave her and nothing else, and you can see it in how she stands." He said it the way Doyle had said the wool was not bad wool, which was as a craftsman recognizing the work of another craftsman. And Wren, who had not thought of herself as a craftsman until that moment, sold him the lamb for $240 and watched him drive away, and then went into the kitchen and sat at the table for a long time. Teodoro put the lamb on his menu the following week with a small line of text under the dish that said the name of the farm and the name of the county. And within 10 days, Wren had 4 phone calls from other restaurants in Asheville and 1 from a restaurant in Greenville. And she did not know what to do with any of them at first, and so she called Doyle, who told her to set a price and stick to it and not to sell more than she could replace in a year. And she called Marisol, who told her the same thing in different words. And she sat down at the kitchen table that night with her notebook and worked out, slowly and with many crossings out, how many lambs she could sell each year without shrinking the flock, and the number she arrived at was 26. She called the restaurants back the next morning, in the order they had called her, and she told each of them what she could supply and what the price would be. And 3 of the 4 said yes immediately, and the 4th said yes a week later, and by the first week of June she had sold every lamb she would have to sell for the rest of the year, at prices that, when she added them up on the back of a feed receipt, came to slightly more than $11,000. She showed the feed receipt to her grandmother that evening. Ardith looked at it for a long moment, and then she said, "That is a year's living for one person on this ridge." Then she said, "If the person is careful." Then she went back to her sewing. Wren put the feed receipt in the drawer, with the soil tests and the well records and the photocopies and the ledger, and she went out to the porch and stood looking at the pasture for a long time. And the small ewe she had been calling Lean, who was no longer lean and who had given birth to twins in March, came up to the gate and stood looking back at her. And Wren reached through the rails and scratched the ewe between the ears. And the ewe stood there, and the sun went down behind the ridge. And that was the end of the first year. The second year went the way her grandfather had written that it would go in a sentence Wren had not understood the first 3 times she read it, which said, "The place will tell you what it wants if you give it 2 seasons to speak." The second year, the pasture told her, the lower pasture, rested through the winter, came in thicker and earlier than it had the previous spring, and the green patch in the middle of it, which Wren had been watching for 14 months, came up first and stayed greenest longest. And in the second week of April, she walked down to the patch with a shovel and dug a hole 3 feet deep in the middle of it. And at the bottom of the hole, in soil that should have been dry that early in the year, water seeped slowly in. She stood looking at the hole for a long time. Then she filled it in and walked back to the house and opened the ledger to the page where her grandfather had drawn the lower pasture. And she found, in the middle of the green patch, a small numbered circle she had noticed before but had not understood. The number was 23. She turned to the back of the ledger and found entry 23, and her grandfather had written in his careful hand, "Perched aquifer, sits on clay, recharges from the ridge, would yield a small spring if opened." Below that, in slightly different ink, as though added later, he had written, "Do not open until you have a use for it." Wren closed the ledger and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and her grandmother, who had been watching her from the doorway without her knowing, said, "You found another one?" Wren said, "Yes." Ardith said, "He used to say there were 7. He only ever opened one, the one that fed the house. The others he left for whoever came after." She said it without sentiment, the way she said everything, and then she walked slowly back to her chair and sat down and picked up her sewing. And Wren sat at the table with the ledger closed under her hand and thought about the word use, which her grandfather had underlined. It took her until July to decide what the use would be, and the decision came not from her but from the sheep, who in the hot weeks of late June began to drift again toward the western fence line, to the stretch of creek where the water came up cold from below. Wren walked down there one evening after the sheep had moved off, and she stood on the bank, and she thought about the perched aquifer in the lower pasture, and she thought about the 9 wells in the township that had hit water between 58 and 84 feet, and she thought about her grandfather's sentence about the ridge holding water like a sponge holds a spill. And she walked back up to the house and called a well driller out of Marshall, whose name Doyle had given her months earlier, and whose name she had written in the back of her notebook and not yet used. The driller, whose name was Bud Vance, came out the following Tuesday and walked the property with her for 2 hours, and she showed him the ledger, which he studied with the expression of a man who had seen many homemade maps in his life and had learned not to dismiss any of them. And at the end of the 2 hours he said, "Your grandfather knew his ground. He said he could drill a test well in the lower pasture for $1,400, and that he would know within a day whether there was water there, and within a week how much." Wren wrote him a check from the lamb money and shook his hand, and he came back the following Monday with his rig and set up in the middle of the green patch, and at a depth of 71 feet his bit dropped into a layer of fractured limestone, and the water came up the casing so fast that Bud Vance, who had been drilling wells in those mountains for 34 years, took off his cap and stood looking at it for a long moment, and then said, "Well," he said, "the flow was strong enough to run a small farm and most of a neighbor's farm besides, and he said the water, when he tested it the next day, was as clean as any he had pulled out of that county in a decade. He charged her another $600 to cap it properly and run a line to the barn, and he told her, as he was loading his rig, that if she ever wanted to drill a second one, he would do it for cost, because he wanted to see what else was under that ridge." She thanked him and paid him and watched him drive down the gravel road, and then she walked up to the house and sat on the porch beside her grandmother and said, "There is water." Ardith did not look at her. Ardith said, "I know." Then Ardith said, "He told me there would be." Then Ardith said, "It took you less time than I thought." The news about the well traveled faster than the news about the wool or the lambs, because a well in that part of the county was a thing every farmer paid attention to, and because Bud Vance, who was not a gossip, but who was a truthful man, answered honestly when asked at the feed store about what he had found on the Cobb place. He said the flow was the best he had hit in 5 years. He said the girl had a map her grandfather had made 40 years ago, and that the map had been right. He said it without embellishment, in the tone of a man reporting weather, and the men at the feed store received the news in a silence that lasted longer than any silence that had followed any of Hollis Renner's previous predictions. Hollis himself was at the feed store that morning. He did not say anything for a long moment after Bud finished. Then he said, "Well." Then he said, "That is something." Then he paid for his salt and walked out to his truck and sat in the cab for a while before he started the engine. And when he finally drove home, he drove past the Cobb place again, and this time he stopped, and he sat in the truck at the end of the gravel drive for almost 5 minutes before he put it in reverse and backed onto the county road and drove on. He came back 2 weeks later on a Saturday morning in the first week of August, and this time he drove up the gravel drive and parked beside the barn and got out of the truck and stood with his hands in his pockets until Wren came out of the house. She came out wiping her hands on a dish towel, and she stopped on the porch when she saw him, and the two of them looked at each other across the yard for a long moment, and then Hollis said, "Mornin'." Wren said, "Mornin'." Hollis said, "I came to see the well." Wren said, "All right." She walked him down to the lower pasture, and the two of them stood at the capped well head in the middle of what had once been the green patch and was now, since the line had been run to the barn, a slightly muddied circle of trampled grass, and Hollis looked at the cap for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Your grandfather and I did not get along." Wren said, "I know." Hollis said, "He was right about a number of things I told him he was wrong about." He said it without looking at her, in the tone of a man reading from a list he had been carrying around for a long time. Then he said, "I told a lot of people at that auction last May that you had thrown your money away." Wren said, "I know that too." Hollis said, "I was wrong." He did not say it loudly. He did not make a large production out of it. He said it the way a man says a thing he has decided he is going to say and has rehearsed in his truck on the drive over. And then he stood looking at the well cap for another long moment, and then he said, "If you ever need a second pair of hands, or a trailer, or a man to stand at a sale ring and not bid against you, you call me." Wren said, "I will." Hollis said, "All right then." And he walked back up to his truck and got in and drove down the gravel drive, and did not come back for almost a month. And when he did come back, it was to bring a bread ewe. He said he had taken in a trade and could not use, and he refused payment for her, and that was the entire arc of his conversion, accomplished without ceremony and without further reference, the way most real things in that valley were accomplished.